A 19-year-old girl, dressed in a faded, oversized hoodie and worn-out sneakers, handed her first-class boarding pass to the flight attendant. The attendant sneered, looking the black teenager up and down before snatching the ticket. "Sweetheart, economy is in the back. You don't belong here, and you are entirely unqualified to be sitting in our premium suites." She had no idea she was speaking to the sole heir of the very aviation empire that signed her paychecks. In a world where status is judged by appearances, a gross miscalculation of power was about to trigger an avalanche of brutal, inescapable karma. By the time this flight was over, careers would be destroyed, and a harsh lesson learned. The ambient hum of John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 was a symphony of rolling Rimowa suitcases, muffled boarding announcements, and the frantic energy of international travel. Camila Reynolds stood quietly near the entrance of Gate B32, a sleek black backpack slung over one shoulder. At 19, Camila preferred comfort over the performative displays of wealth typical of her family's tax bracket. She wore a vintage Yale sweatshirt, charcoal sweatpants, and a pair of beat-up Converse. Her natural curls were pulled back into a messy bun. She was waiting to board Global Oceanic Airlines Flight 402 to London Heathrow, a flagship route operated on a massive Boeing 777-300ER. Camila wasn't just a passenger. She was an aviation engineering student at MIT and, more importantly, the daughter of Radley Reynolds. Radley was the ruthless, self-made billionaire who owned Vanguard Holdings, the private equity firm that had just acquired a 60% controlling stake in Global Oceanic. As the gate agent announced the commencement of first-class and diamond medallion boarding, Camila stepped into the priority lane. Behind her, heavy footsteps approached. Charles Montgomery, a 50-something hedge fund executive, draped in a bespoke Tom Ford suit and reeking of scotch and expensive cologne, bumped her shoulder. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he scoffed, looking at her casual attire. "Excuse me," Charles barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "This line is for first class. Coach boards in about 40 minutes, kid." Camila glanced over her shoulder, her expression flat. "I'm in the right line, thank you." Charles rolled his eyes and stepped around her, presenting his digital boarding pass to the lead gate agent, a woman whose name tag read Beatrice, Senior Purser. Beatrice beamed at Charles, a practiced, saccharine smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Montgomery. A pleasure to have you flying with us to London today. Right this way." Camila stepped up next, placing her phone on the optical scanner. A pleasant beep confirmed her boarding pass. Seat 1A, the most exclusive suite on the aircraft. Beatrice's smile instantly vanished. Her eyes darted from the screen to Camila, performing a rapid, judgmental calculus. "Miss, there must be a glitch in the system. The scanner just registered a first-class boarding group for you." "Yes," Camila said calmly. "Seat 1A." Beatrice let out a patronizing sigh, crossing her arms over her crisp navy blue uniform. "Look, honey, I know the airport can be confusing, but priority boarding is strictly for our premium cabin guests. Sometimes the app glitches and shows the wrong group. Let me see your actual ticket." Camila unlocked her phone and handed it over. Beatrice squinted at the screen, her frown deepening. The ticket clearly read Camila Reynolds, First Class Suite 1A, Fare Class F. "Where did you get this?" Beatrice demanded, her tone shifting from patronizing to accusatory. "Did you buy this on a third-party discount site, or is this a staff buddy pass? Because if you're flying non-revenue, you are completely unqualified to sit in a revenue-generating first-class suite. You'll be seated in the rear. I bought it directly through the airline's portal," Camila said, her voice steady, refusing to be intimidated. "It's a fully paid, unrestricted F-class fare. If there's an issue, you can check the PNR locator." Beatrice scoffed, clearly insulted that a teenager in sweatpants knew the terminology for a passenger name record. "I don't have time to debate a system error with a teenager. Just go down the jet bridge. I'll have the cabin crew sort you out inside." Camila took her phone back, shook her head slightly, and walked down the glass-lined corridor toward the plane. She had dealt with racial and age-based profiling before, but the blatant disrespect from an employee of her father's company left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had no idea the situation was about to escalate into a full-blown nightmare. Stepping onto the aircraft, Camila was greeted by the lavish interior of the first-class cabin. Dark walnut paneling, Plush leather seats and soft, warm lighting created an oasis of luxury. She found Suite 1A at the bulkhead, stowed her backpack in the overhead bin, and settled into the wide seat. She pulled out a thick textbook on aerospace fluid dynamics, ready to study for an upcoming midterm. A few minutes later, Charles Montgomery boarded. He walked down the aisle, expecting to take his usual favored seat 1A. When he saw Camila sitting there, his face turned a vibrant shade of magenta. He checked his ticket, seat 1B, right across the aisle, but not the window suite he demanded. Charles immediately flagged down Beatrice, who had just stepped onto the plane to oversee the cabin prep. "Beatrice," Charles snapped, pointing a manicured finger at Camila. "Why is she in 1A? I always sit in 1A. My assistant specifically requested the bulkhead window." Beatrice's face paled, eager to placate the wealthy executive. "I apologize, Mr. Montgomery. There seems to have been a massive ticketing error today." Beatrice marched over to Camila's suite, her posture rigid with authority. "Miss, I'm going to need you to pack up your things and move. Right now." Camila didn't look up from her textbook. "Move where?" "To your actual seat. Economy. Row 42, Beatrice stated loudly, ensuring the other boarding first-class passengers could hear. "You are holding a fraudulent ticket, and Mr. Montgomery requires this suite." Camila slowly closed her textbook, marking the page with her finger. "My ticket isn't fraudulent. I paid for this seat. Seat 1A. Mr. Montgomery's ticket is for 1B. I can see it on his phone from here." "Listen to me very carefully," Beatrice hissed, leaning in close. "I am the senior purser on this aircraft. I know the profiles of our first-class passengers. You do not fit the demographic, nor do you possess the qualifications to sit in this cabin. I don't know whose credit card you used to game our website, but we have strict security protocols against credit card fraud. Now get up before I call security." Charles chuckled from the aisle. "Just throw her off the plane, Beatrice. It's ridiculous that we have to share airspace with people who clearly don't belong in polite society. She probably doesn't even understand the words coming out of your mouth." Camila's eyes hardened. The casual racism, the blatant elitism, the sheer incompetence of the crew member, it all crystallized into a sharp, icy focus. According to Federal Aviation Regulation Part 2, 152, and Global Oceanic's own contract of carriage, involuntary downgrades require an immediate cash compensation of 400% of the fare difference, plus a written statement of cause. Camila recited perfectly. Furthermore, accusing a passenger of credit card fraud without consulting the ticketing database or the gate agent is a violation of the airline's customer service charter. "You are out of line, Beatrice." Beatrice stepped back, momentarily stunned by the sudden, precise barrage of aviation law. But her shock quickly morphed into absolute fury. Her authority had been challenged by a black teenager in front of her most valued passengers. "You are completely unqualified to quote policy to me," Beatrice shouted, her professional veneer shattering. "You're an arrogant little girl who scammed her way onto my plane. I am the authority here. You are moving to the back, or you are getting off my aircraft." "I'm not moving," Camila said, crossing her legs and leaning back into the leather seat. "Call the captain. Let's see what he has to say about an illegal involuntary downgrade to appease a whiny hedge fund manager." Charles slammed his briefcase onto the floor. "That's it. Get her out of here. I'm not flying with this delinquent." Beatrice snatched the intercom phone off the wall and punched in the code for the cockpit. "Captain Harrison, I need you in the first-class cabin immediately. We have a hostile, unqualified passenger refusing crew instructions." Within moments, the cockpit door swung open. Captain Thomas Harrison, a man in his late 50s with a stern, weathered face, emerged. He looked irritated by the disruption to his pre-flight checks. "What's the issue, Beatrice?" Captain Harrison asked. "This young woman," Beatrice said, pointing a trembling finger at Camila, "is sitting in Mr. Montgomery's requested seat. Her ticket flagged as a glitch at the gate, and she's highly suspected of credit card fraud. When I politely asked her to relocate to her proper seat in economy, she became combative and started spewing nonsense about aviation law." Captain Harrison didn't bother to ask for Camila's ticket. He didn't ask for her side of the story. He looked at Charles Montgomery, a man he recognized from previous flights, and then looked at Camila, a young black girl in a hoodie. His bias made the decision for him in a fraction of a second. "Miss," Captain Harrison said, his voice dropping an octave to project absolute command. The flight crew's instructions are federal law. If Beatrice tells you to move, you move. I will not have my departure delayed by a disruptive teenager. Grab your bag and head to the back, or I'm calling Port Authority to drag you off this plane. Camila looked at the captain, a profound sense of disappointment washing over her. She realized the rot in her father's new airline wasn't just at the gate. It went all the way up to the command structure. They were all complicit. Captain Harrison, Camila said evenly, I strongly advise you to check the passenger manifest on your tablet. Check the last name. Check the VIP flags. If you throw me off this plane, you will be ending your career. Charles burst into laughter. Oh, she's threatening the captain now. Unbelievable. That's a federal offense. Beatrice smirked triumphantly. She just threatened the flight crew. That's it. I'm not dealing with this, Captain Harrison snapped. He grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Flight 402. I need airport police at Gate B32 immediately. We have a code 3, hostile passenger removal. 10 minutes later, the boarding process was completely halted. 4 armed Port Authority police officers marched down the aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet. The other passengers watched in a mix of shock and morbid curiosity as the officers surrounded Suite 1A. Miss, you need to come with us, the lead officer said, resting his hand on his duty belt. The captain wants you removed. Camila didn't fight. She didn't scream. She knew exactly how this game was played, and she knew the weapon she possessed was far more powerful than a tantrum. She calmly picked up her textbook, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and stood up. As she walked past Charles Montgomery, he offered a smug, victorious wave. Enjoy the bus ride home, kid. Beatrice stood by the cockpit door, a satisfied grin plastered across her face. Next time, learn your place before you try to fly premium. Camila stepped off the aircraft and into the cold, sterile environment of the jet bridge. The police officers instructed her to stand against the glass wall while they took down her information. I need to make one phone call, Camila said to the lead officer. I am fully cooperating, but I need to call my father. The officer, seeing that the young girl was entirely calm and nonviolent, contrary to the captain's frantic report, nodded. Make it quick. Camila pulled out her phone. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call customer service. She dialed a number saved simply as Dad. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Camila, you should be taking off right now. Everything okay? Hey, Dad, Camila said, staring through the jet bridge window at the massive nose of the Boeing 777. I'm off the plane. The senior purser and the captain just had me removed by armed police. There was a long, terrifying silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence that precedes a hurricane. Why? Radley Reynolds asked, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Because they decided I was unqualified to sit in first class, Camila said, her voice finally breaking just a fraction, the adrenaline of the injustice catching up to her. They gave my paid seat to a hedge fund manager because I didn't look the part, Dad. They accused me of fraud. Another pause. When Radley spoke again, the billionaire titan of Vanguard Holdings wasn't just angry, he was going to war. Keep the officers there. Do not let that plane push back from the gate, Radley ordered. I am 10 minutes away from Terminal 4. Nobody moves until I get there. The heavy steel door of the Boeing 777 sealed shut with a resonant thud, severing the first-class cabin from the jet bridge. Through the small, reinforced window, Camila could see Beatrice giving a triumphant thumbs up to the gate agent. The message was clear. The problem had been disposed of. Out on the tarmac, the massive aircraft's engines began to spool up with a deafening, high-pitched whine. The pushback tug, a low-slung behemoth of yellow steel, locked onto the plane's front landing gear. Flight 402 was preparing for departure, leaving a 19-year-old girl detained by Port Authority officers in the cold, fluorescent-lit corridor of Terminal 4. All right, miss, the lead officer said, his tone softening slightly now that the plane was secured. We're going to need to escort you to the terminal holding area to process the captain's report. It's standard procedure for a hostile passenger removal. Camila didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the illuminated numbers above the gate doors. I wouldn't advise doing the paperwork just yet, officer. That plane isn't going anywhere. The officer let out a tired sigh. Look, kid. I don't know who you think you are, but once those doors close and the beacon light flashes, only God or the FAA can stop a transatlantic flight. Your dad might be a hotshot lawyer, but he can't stop a commercial airliner. He's not a lawyer, Camilla replied, her voice eerily calm. Suddenly, the heavy security doors at the top of the jet bridge burst open with such force that they banged against the concrete walls. The rhythmic, urgent sound of dress shoes slamming against the floor echoed down the tunnel. 4 men in immaculate, tailored suits marched down the incline, moving in a tight, aggressive formation. At the center was Reynolds. The billionaire titan of Vanguard Holdings moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of a man who spent his life dismantling corporations and destroying rivals. His face was a mask of absolute, chilling rage. Flanking him were 2 massive private security contractors and his chief legal officer, Arthur Pendleton. Following closely behind them, practically sprinting and dripping with nervous sweat, was the Terminal 4 Operations Director, a man named Miller. "Mr. Reynolds, please?" "Sir," Miller gasped, struggling to keep up. "We have to go through proper channels. The aircraft has already transferred to ground control." Reynolds ignored him completely. He strode directly up to the Port Authority officers surrounding his daughter. The officers, trained to assess threats, instinctively took a step back. The sheer aura of power radiating from the man was suffocating. "Dad," Camilla said quietly. Reynolds stopped in front of her. The furious lines around his eyes softened for a fraction of a second as he looked his daughter up and down, ensuring she wasn't harmed. "Are you okay, Camilla?" "I'm fine. Just displaced," she replied, gesturing to her backpack on the floor. Reynolds turned his attention to the lead officer. His eyes were like chipped ice. "I am going to ask you this exactly once. On whose authority was my daughter removed from her paid suite?" The officer bristled, trying to maintain his authority. "Sir, you are in a restricted security area. The captain of Flight 402 ordered her removal for being combative, fraudulent ticketing, and failing to comply with crew instructions. Now I need you to step back." "Arthur," Reynolds interrupted, not breaking eye contact with the officer. Arthur Pendleton, the ruthless corporate attorney, stepped forward, producing a sleek, leather folio. "Officer, my client is the majority shareholder and chairman of the board of Global Oceanic Airlines. The young woman you are currently detaining without cause is his sole heir. If you do not step aside immediately, you will not only be facing a civil rights lawsuit that will bankrupt your department, but you will also be personally named in a federal kidnapping suit, as she has committed no crime and was illegally removed from private property." The color drained from the officer's face so fast he looked physically ill. He looked at Camilla's worn Yale sweatshirt, then back to the billionaire standing before him. The realization of the catastrophic mistake hit him like a physical blow. "Mr. Reynolds, we were just following the captain's dispatch." The officer stammered, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "We didn't know." "Ignorance is not an excuse for gross incompetence," Reynolds snapped. He turned his terrifying gaze to Miller, the operations director. "Miller, reconnect that bridge. Now." "Sir, they've already detached. The tug is moving them to the taxiway." "It violates DOT regulations to recall a flight for a passenger." Reynolds stepped into Miller's personal space. "Did I stutter, Miller? You are going to radio the ramp control tower. You are going to tell them Flight 402 has a critical security breach and requires an immediate return to the gate. If that plane reaches the runway, I will personally see to it that you never work in the aviation industry again. Call it in. Now." Miller scrambled for his heavy-duty radio, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. "Ground control, this is Terminal Ops. We have an emergency recall on Global Oceanic 402 at Gate B32. Halt pushback. I repeat, halt pushback and return to the bridge immediately. Captain's orders are overridden by corporate command." Outside the window, the massive Boeing 777 jerked to a sudden, unnatural halt. The whining of the engines dialed down. The flashing red beacon light turned off. Inside the jet bridge, the silence was deafening. The ultimate flex of power had just been executed. A fully loaded international flight had been stopped dead in its tracks. Inside the first-class cabin of Flight 402, the sudden jolt of the brakes spilling their champagne glasses caused a ripple of murmurs among the elite passengers. Charles Montgomery cursed, dabbing at his ruined Tom Ford trousers with a linen napkin. Unbelievable. What is the delay now? Beatrice, the senior purser, was equally frustrated. She stormed toward the cockpit door to demand an explanation, but before she could punch in the entry code, the heavy main cabin door unsealed. The pressure equalized with a loud hiss, and the door was violently yanked open from the outside by the ground crew. Beatrice marched into the galley space, her face flushed with anger. What is the meaning of this? We are cleared for departure. You cannot open the doors once we... She stopped dead. Stepping onto the aircraft was not a baggage handler or a gate agent. It was a man radiating pure, unadulterated menace, flanked by two men who looked like ex-military operatives. "Sir, you cannot board this aircraft," Beatrice shouted, her shrill voice echoing into the quiet first-class cabin. "This is a sterile flight. Security." Reynolds didn't even look at her. He walked right past her, his shoulder brushing hers with enough force to make her stumble back against the galley counter. He stepped into the aisle of the first-class cabin. Behind him, Camilla walked back onto the plane, looking entirely unfazed. Arthur Pendleton brought up the rear, casually locking the heavy cabin door from the inside. They had taken over the aircraft. Charles, still dabbing his pants, looked up to see who was causing the commotion. When his eyes locked onto the towering figure of the billionaire, the hedge fund executive froze. The arrogance melted from his face, replaced by a pale, sickening dread. Anyone who worked in high finance in New York knew who Reynolds was. He was the apex predator of Wall Street. Charles immediately stood up, plastering on a nervous, ingratiating smile. "Mr. Reynolds, good God, what an unexpected honor. Are you joining us to London? Please, let me get out of your way." "Sit down, Charles," Reynolds commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a lethal weight that made the hair on the back of Charles's neck stand up. Charles dropped back into the seat, sweet 1A, as if his strings had been cut. Reynolds stood over him. "You are sitting in my daughter's seat." The cabin went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop over the low hum of the air conditioning. Charles's eyes darted frantically from Reynolds to the young black girl in the Yale sweatshirt standing quietly in the aisle. Your daughter?" Charles whispered, his voice cracking. He looked like he was going to vomit. I had no idea. There was a ticketing error. The crew told me." "Don't lie to me, Charles. I read the PNR manifest from the gate terminal before I walked down here. You were ticketed for 1B. My daughter paid for 1A, Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. You saw a teenager who didn't fit your narrow, pathetic worldview of wealth, and you decided you were entitled to her space. You humiliated her. You laughed while she was escorted off by armed police. Mr. Reynolds, please, it was a misunderstanding, Charles pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead. If I had known she was a Reynolds, that is exactly the point. Camilla spoke up, her voice clear and piercing. You shouldn't have to know my last name to treat me like a human being. You judged me because I'm young, I'm black, and I wasn't wearing a designer suit. At that moment, Beatrice rushed down the aisle, completely oblivious to the shifting power dynamics. She had finally recovered from being pushed aside and was ready to assert her authority. Excuse me. I don't care who you think you are, but you are trespassing on a federal. Reynolds turned his head slowly to look at her. Beatrice stopped mid-sentence. There was something in his eyes that triggered a primal survival instinct, telling her to run. You must be Beatrice, Reynolds said, reading her name tag. The senior purser who determined my daughter was unqualified to fly on the airline I own. Beatrice's jaw dropped. The blood vanished from her face. She looked at Camilla, then back at Reynolds. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, forming a picture of her impending doom. Sir, The system flagged her ticket. Beatrice stammered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. I was just protecting the integrity of the first-class cabin. We have protocols against fraud. Protocol? Reynolds stepped toward her. Beatrice shrank back against the bulkhead. Let's talk about protocol, Beatrice. Did you check her identification against the ticketing database? No. Did you offer the legally required compensation for an involuntary downgrade? No. Did you profile a fully paying passenger based on her race and attire, accuse her of a felony, and incite a security incident to appease a whiny hedge fund manager? I. Beatrice couldn't speak. Tears of pure panic welled in her eyes. The career she had built over 20 years was disintegrating before her eyes. The cockpit doors swung open violently. Captain Thomas stepped out, his face red with fury. "What is going on out here? Who authorized the door to be opened?" "We were on the taxiway." He stormed into the cabin, stopping when he saw the towering billionaire. "Captain," Reynolds said smoothly, though the anger underneath was boiling, "I am the chairman of Vanguard Holdings. You just ordered the illegal removal of my daughter from this aircraft without verifying a single fact." Captain Thomas, a man used to absolute authority in the sky, tried to puff out his chest. "Sir, I am the pilot in command. My aircraft, my rules." She was reported as a disruptive security threat by my purser. "I don't care who you are. Aviation law dictates. Aviation law dictates that the pilot in command must make decisions based on verified facts, not the prejudiced whims of a flight attendant," Reynolds interrupted, cutting him down to size. "You failed to investigate. You failed to uphold the airline's customer charter. You weaponized the Port Authority against a 19-year-old girl." Reynolds turned to his lawyer. "Arthur, draft the termination papers, effective immediately." Arthur nodded, pulling a pen from his breast pocket. "For cause, Mr. Reynolds? Gross misconduct in violation of civil rights?" "Yes," Reynolds confirmed, staring coldly at the captain. "You are fired, Captain. Beatrice, you are fired. Collect your personal belongings and get off my aircraft." The collective gasp from the surrounding first-class passengers was audible. Charles Montgomery sat completely paralyzed in Suite 1A, realizing the devastating storm of karma had only just begun. The first-class cabin of Flight 402 had transformed from an oasis of transatlantic luxury into a pressurized vacuum chamber. The breathable air seemed to have been entirely sucked out the moment Radley Reynolds stepped past the bulkhead. The ambient, soothing hum of the Boeing 777's auxiliary power unit was the only sound daring to break the suffocating, heavy tension. Every passenger in the elite cabin sat completely paralyzed, their complimentary champagne flutes abandoned, their eyes fixed on the terrifying tableau unfolding in the aisle. Captain Thomas stood rigid, his weathered face contorting in a violent, messy collision of deeply ingrained authority and sudden, blinding panic. For 25 years, he had piloted commercial heavy jets across oceans. In the sky and on the tarmac, he was an absolute monarch. His word was federal law. The sudden realization that a man in a bespoke suit had just grounded him, stripped him of his command, and humiliated him in front of his highest-paying passengers with a single, softly spoken sentence was too much for his ego to process. "You can't do this," Captain Thomas sputtered. His voice, usually a soothing, authoritative baritone over the intercom, now carried the panicked, reedy tremor of a man watching his life's work and his lucrative pension evaporate into thin air. He puffed out his chest, a desperate, final attempt to reclaim his territory. "The pilots' union will strike by midnight. You cannot fire a pilot in command on an active tarmac without a full FAA review board." Arthur Pendleton, Vanguard Holdings' chief legal officer, stepped forward. He moved with the cold, frictionless grace of a predator that had cornered its prey. His expression was entirely devoid of sympathy, his eyes flat and assessing. "Mr. Reynolds is the majority stakeholder and chairman of the parent conglomerate that successfully absorbed your union's contract just last month," Arthur stated, his voice clipping the silent air with surgical precision. "I suggest you familiarize yourself with Section 4, Clause 12 of your new collective bargaining agreement. Immediate termination is authorized for gross negligence, resulting in severe liability exposure. By failing to verify a passenger's ticketing status, refusing to consult the gate agent, and initiating a hostile removal by armed law enforcement based strictly on the discriminatory, unfounded profiling by your purser, you have exposed Global Oceanic to a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar civil rights lawsuit. You bypassed every safety and customer service protocol in our manual." Arthur paused, letting the immense legal weight of his words crush the remaining fight out of the pilot. He extended an open, expectant palm. "Your badge, Captain, and your epaulets. You are no longer authorized to be on this aircraft." Thomas looked at Arthur's unyielding hand, then shifted his gaze to the towering, immovable figure of Radley Reynolds. The billionaire's eyes were like chipped ice, offering no quarter, no mercy, and no avenue for negotiation. The fight drained out of Thomas instantly, his shoulders slumping under the invisible weight of his ruin. With trembling, clumsy hands, he unclipped his secure aviation badge from his lanyard and dropped it into Arthur's palm. A few feet away, by the galley partition, Beatrice finally shattered. The senior purser collapsed heavily into the empty jump seat, her hands covering her face as she began to sob uncontrollably. The smug, patronizing gatekeeper who had sneered at a teenager in a faded sweatshirt, who had relished the power trip of throwing a young black girl off her flight, was completely, unequivocally gone. In her place was a broken, terrified woman staring down the barrel of unemployment, public disgrace, and the permanent loss of the career that defined her. "Please, please, Camila," Beatrice begged, dropping her hands. Her pristine, navy blue uniform was rumpled, her face flushed and heavily streaked with dark, running mascara. She turned her tear-filled eyes toward the 19-year-old standing quietly beside her father. "I am so sorry. I misjudged you. I made a terrible mistake. We were so delayed, and I was just so stressed about the turnaround time. Please, you have to tell your father. I have a family. I can't lose my wings." Camila looked down at the weeping woman. There was no gloating in the teenager's eyes, no petty triumph. Instead, there was a profound, weary understanding of the cruelty she had just endured. "You weren't stressed, Beatrice," Camila said, her voice soft, measured, but entirely unforgiving. The quiet clarity of her words resonated off the walnut paneling of the cabin. "You were comfortable. You were entirely comfortable looking at me, evaluating my skin color and my clothes, and deciding I was inherently beneath you. You didn't just ask me to move. You accused me of a felony. You called me unqualified to sit in the seat I paid for. You enjoyed trying to humiliate me in front of these people." Camila paused, her gaze steady, refusing to let Beatrice look away. "You weren't worried about protocols. You were offended by my presence. You weaponized the police against me because you thought I was powerless and had no voice. Actions have consequences, Beatrice. You earned yours today." Radley Reynolds didn't waste another glance on the fired, weeping crew members. They were collateral damage now, handled and dismissed. He turned his terrifying, predatory focus toward the man who was still sitting, completely paralyzed, in Suite 1A. Charles Montgomery. Charles swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight, silk collar. He gripped the plush leather armrests of the suite so tightly his knuckles were stark white, his manicured fingernails digging into the seams. He could feel the collective eyes of the cabin burning into his skin. "Mr. Reynolds." "Sir," Charles whispered, his voice cracking violently. He tried to force a placating, collegial smile, but it looked more like a grimace of pure agony. I am just a passenger here. I had absolutely no part in the crew's operational decisions. I merely asked the attendant for my preferred window seat. It was a misunderstanding. If I had known she was your daughter, if I had any idea who she was, I swear to you on my life, I would have offered to move to economy myself." Mr. Reynolds let out a low, dark chuckle. It was a terrifying sound, devoid of any humor, that sent a collective shiver down the spine of every elite passenger within earshot. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Suite 1A, looming over the trembling hedge fund executive, casting a long, dark shadow that completely swallowed Charles. "That's the ultimate tragedy of men like you, Charles," Reynolds said, his voice a low, lethal purr. "You only respect power. You only show basic human decency when you realize there's a predator bigger than you in the room. You watched them drag a teenager away, and you laughed. You waved goodbye." Reynolds tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're a managing director at Apex Capital Partners, aren't you? Equities division, if I recall correctly." Charles nodded frantically, a desperate glimmer of hope lighting up his panicked eyes. "A business connection. He could leverage this." Yes, sir, we actually handle some of Vanguard's secondary tier investments. We have a great relationship with your firm." "Not anymore," Reynolds said smoothly, extinguishing that hope instantly. He reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke suit jacket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. Without breaking eye contact with the sweating man in front of him, he dialed a number from his contacts, pressed the speaker icon, and held the phone up in the quiet cabin. It rang twice. Radley Reynolds, a crisp, professional, and slightly overly eager voice answered. It was Jonathan Bradley, the formidable CEO of Apex Capital Partners. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? We weren't scheduled to review the Vanguard portfolio until Q3. Tell me you have good news. Jonathan, Reynolds said, his tone entirely conversational, yet laced with a venom so potent it made Charles physically recoil. I am currently standing in the aisle of a global oceanic flight destined for London. I'm looking down at one of your managing directors, a man named Charles Montgomery. Ah, Charles. Great guy, one of our absolute top earners, Jonathan replied brightly, blissfully oblivious to the impending slaughter playing out on speakerphone. Is he bothering you? Let me know if he talks your ear off about the tech sector. He just conspired with a racist flight crew to have my 19-year-old daughter illegally removed from her fully paid first-class suite by armed Port Authority police, Reynolds stated flatly, his voice chilling the air. Simply because he didn't like the way she was dressed, he didn't think a young black girl belonged in his vicinity, and he felt entitled to steal her seat. The silence on the other end of the phone was absolute, deafening, and profound. Even through the tiny speaker of the smartphone, the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the CEO of Apex Capital was palpable. Vanguard Holdings managed over $40 billion in assets. Pulling their investments wouldn't just hurt Apex, it would gut the firm overnight, causing a catastrophic collapse in their stock price and triggering a mass exodus of clients. Jonathan, Reynolds continued, his voice dropping to a deadly, uncompromising whisper that commanded the attention of everyone on board. I am going to give you exactly 10 seconds to make a permanent decision. You either terminate Charles Montgomery for cause right now, effectively blacklisting him from Wall Street for the rest of his natural life, or I will instruct my team to liquidate every single Vanguard asset held by Apex Capital by the time the opening bell rings tomorrow morning. I will bleed your entire firm dry before lunch. Charles let out a strangled, desperate gasp, lunging forward slightly against his seatbelt. Jonathan, no. Please, you have to listen to me. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't. Charles, shut your goddamn mouth. Jonathan roared through the phone, his voice echoing violently off the curved ceiling of the cabin. There was a tense, agonizing pause of exactly 2 seconds as the CEO calculated the math. One managing director versus $40 billion. It wasn't even a choice. Radley. Consider it done, Jonathan said, his voice shaking slightly, stripped of all its former joviality. Montgomery is terminated, effective this exact second. Security will have his office boxed up and his access cards deactivated before his plane even lands. We will issue a formal, public apology to your daughter by noon tomorrow. Please. I beg you, do not pull the Vanguard funds. See that you do, Reynolds said coldly. He didn't say goodbye. He simply ended the call, the sharp beep echoing like a gunshot. Charles Montgomery looked like a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. His 6-figure year-end bonus, his corner office overlooking Manhattan, his summer home, his country club memberships, his entire untouchable identity as a master of the universe, all of it had been systematically dismantled and incinerated in less than 60 seconds. Now, Reynolds said, looking down at the ruined, shattered man with absolute disgust. Get out of my daughter's seat. Charles Montgomery didn't say a word. He couldn't. His throat had constricted so tightly it felt as though he were swallowing crushed glass. He sat frozen in Suite 1A, the very seat he had so ruthlessly demanded, staring blankly at the mahogany tray table. His mind was a chaotic, high-speed collision of terrifying realizations. In the span of a single, agonizing minute, the fortress of wealth and privilege he had spent 30 years building had been completely vaporized. His prestigious title as managing director, his lucrative equity shares, his sprawling summer estate in the Hamptons, his entire identity as a master of the Wall Street universe, all of it had been incinerated by a man making a casual phone call from an airplane aisle. Mechanically, slowly, Charles stood up. The bespoke Tom Ford suit, which had looked so intimidating and sharp just half an hour earlier, now seemed to hang limply on his suddenly deflated frame. He looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. He reached down and grabbed his designer leather briefcase from the floor, his hands trembling so violently that the metal clasps rattled against each other in the quiet cabin. He didn't dare look at Camila. He couldn't even bring himself to look at Mr. Reynolds. He just stared straight ahead, a hollow shell of the arrogant executive he had been. Mr. Reynolds turned away from the ruined man, dismissing him entirely. He shifted his attention toward the galley, where the Port Authority police officers were still standing in stunned silence. These seasoned officers, trained to handle high-stress security threats, were watching this unprecedented display of billionaire power with wide, disbelieving eyes. They had arrived expecting to drag off a hostile teenager. Instead, they had just witnessed the surgical, corporate execution of 3 powerful adults. "Officers," Reynolds called out smoothly, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a king addressing his guard. "The captain and the senior purser are no longer employees of this airline, meaning they are currently trespassing on a sterile commercial aircraft. Furthermore, this man," he paused, pointing a long, steady finger at the trembling Charles Montgomery, "is no longer welcome on this flight. Please escort all 3 of them back to the terminal immediately." The lead officer, still mentally reeling from the horrifying realization that he had nearly slapped handcuffs on the sole heiress to the airline's parent company, snapped to attention and nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir. Right away, Mr. Reynolds. We'll handle it." The officers stepped heavily into the plush cabin, their duty belts clinking in the oppressive silence. "All right, folks. Let's go." "Nice and easy," the lead officer said, gesturing firmly toward the open cabin door. "Gather your personal belongings and move toward the exit." It was the ultimate, agonizing walk of shame. Beatrice went first. The once proud senior purser, who had stood like a self-righteous gatekeeper, denying Camila her rightful place, was completely unrecognizable. She was weeping softly, her shoulders shaking with every muffled sob. Her immaculate makeup was ruined, dark streaks of mascara running down her pale cheeks and staining the crisp white collar of her uniform. The 20-year career she had guarded so fiercely was gone, shattered by her own unchecked prejudice. Captain Thomas Harrison followed closely behind her. The pilot in command walked with a stooped, defeated posture. The gleaming gold epaulets on his shoulders, once symbols of his undisputed authority in the sky, now seemed to mock him. He looked suddenly old and frail, stripped of his power, his pension, and his dignity. Finally, Charles Montgomery shuffled down the aisle. He moved like a ghost, his eyes dead and unfocused. As he passed by the other first-class suites, the collective hypocrisy of the elite cabin was on full display. The same wealthy passengers who had previously scoffed at Camila, whispered behind their hands, and rolled their eyes at the disruptive teenager now desperately averted their gazes. They stared intensely at their laps, suddenly fascinated by the stitching on their leather armrests or the blank screens of their tablets. Nobody dared to make eye contact with the young black teenager in the faded Yale sweatshirt, and absolutely no one wanted to draw the attention of the terrifying, wrathful billionaire standing protectively beside her. Once the disgraced trio had finally disappeared into the cold, fluorescent-lit jet bridge and out of sight, a profound shift occurred within the cabin. Mr. Reynolds turned slowly to face his daughter. Instantly, the icy, ruthless corporate titan vanished. The sharp, predatory lines of his face softened, and the cold fire in his eyes melted into profound, aching warmth. He was no longer the chairman of Vanguard Holdings. He was just a fiercely protective father making sure his child was safe. He stepped forward and pulled Camila into a tight, grounding hug. He held her as if shielding her from the sheer ugliness of what had just transpired. "Are you absolutely sure you still want to take this flight, sweetheart?" he asked softly, his deep voice muffled against her hair. "You don't have to endure this. We can leave right now and take the private jet. I can have the Gulfstream fueled, catered, and wheels up in less than an hour." Camila closed her eyes, hugging him back fiercely. She buried her face in his shoulder just for a moment, allowing the lingering adrenaline and the sting of the initial humiliation to finally wash away. Her father's embrace was an anchor, steady and unbreakable. Taking a deep breath, she pulled away and looked up at him, offering a small, quietly confident smile. "No, Dad, I paid for this seat. I earned my place here, and I'm not going to let them run me off my own flight," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "Besides, I have that massive fluid dynamics midterm next week, and the Wi-Fi on these new 777S is actually pretty good. I need the study time." Reynolds let out a warm, genuine laugh, a sound of pure pride that echoed brightly in the quiet cabin. It was the first joyful sound heard on the aircraft in over an hour. "That's my girl," Unstoppable. Call me the absolute second your tires touch the tarmac at Heathrow. Arthur will be waiting for you at baggage claim with a car. I will. Love you, Dad. I love you too, Camilla, more than anything. Reynolds gave her shoulder a final, reassuring squeeze, nodded respectfully to his towering security detail, and turned to leave the aircraft. Arthur Pendleton, the brilliant and terrifying chief legal officer, followed closely behind him. Arthur paused only for a brief moment at the door to address Miller, the operations director, who was still hovering nervously just inside the jet bridge, drenched in a cold sweat. "Miller," Arthur ordered, his voice clipping the air with icy efficiency. "Get a standby captain and a replacement purser onto this aircraft immediately, and issue a $5,000 travel voucher to every single passenger currently seated on this flight to compensate for this delay. Bill it directly to the Vanguard executive account. Ensure this flight is airborne within 20 minutes. Yes, Mr. Pendleton. Right away, sir, Miller stammered, already reaching for his heavy-duty radio. Arthur nodded sharply and disappeared up the tunnel, following his boss back into the terminal. 15 minutes later, a breathless, highly apologetic standby crew rushed aboard. They moved with military precision, desperate to correct the catastrophic failures of their predecessors. The new senior purser, a kind-faced, veteran flight attendant who had clearly been thoroughly briefed by ground control regarding the absolute necessity of flawless, respectful service, approached Suite 1A. She carried a silver tray bearing a crystal glass of sparkling water, a fresh linen napkin, and a ramekin of warm, sea salt mixed nuts. "Miss Reynolds," the new purser said, her voice trembling slightly with deference, though her smile was incredibly warm and genuine. "On behalf of the entire Global Oceanic Executive Team and this new crew, we are profoundly sorry for the unacceptable delay and the horrifying behavior you experienced today. Is there absolutely anything I can get you to make you more comfortable before takeoff?" "Just the water is perfect. Thank you so much," Camilla said politely, offering the woman a kind, reassuring smile as she took the glass. A few moments later, the heavy cabin door was finally, firmly sealed. The pressure equalized with a soft hiss. Outside, the powerful pushback tug engaged, and the massive Boeing 777 began its slow, deliberate crawl toward the taxiway. Camilla sank deep into the plush, fragrant leather of Suite 1A. She took a slow, refreshing sip of her sparkling water, reached into her worn backpack, and pulled out her heavy aerospace textbook. She adjusted her overhead reading light, letting the warm beam illuminate the complex equations on the page. Outside her large window, the bright, sprawling lights of JFK International Airport began to blur into long, glowing streaks of amber and white as the massive jet engines roared to life. The plane accelerated violently down the runway, pressing Camilla back into her seat before gracefully lifting off into the dark, limitless expanse of the night sky. Justice had been served cold, fast, and relentlessly. The unqualified teenager was exactly where she belonged, soaring majestically at 30,000 feet, leaving the people who had tried to drag her down far behind in the dust. The audacity of entitlement often blinds people to the reality of who they are truly dealing with. Camilla's calm demeanor in the face of blatant profiling and illegal airline practices sets the stage for a spectacular reckoning. When arrogance overrides basic human decency, the universe, or in this case, a fiercely protective billionaire father, has a way of delivering swift and absolute justice. If you found your blood boiling at Beatrice and Charles's behavior, just wait until you see the devastating reality check coming their way in the next chapters. If you loved this dramatic start, please hit the like button, share this story with your friends who love a good karma-served cold tale, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the explosive arrival of Radley Reynolds.